This lecture is about fantasy in children's literature by Dr. Soo Mi-chum. Modern fantasy goes beyond the known world. It consists of story elements that violate the natural and physical laws. Because it imaginatively creates a new or transformed world, the world created by fantasy can refresh, delight, and give a new vision. Myths, legends, and folktales are predecessors of modern fantasy. Many of early works are enjoyed by today's children. The Wonderful Wizard of Oz is one of those. It is the first modern fantasy for children published in the United States. There are two different degrees of fantasy. Low fantasy is set in the primary world, but the magical elements of fantasy make the story impossible. High fantasy is set in the secondary world, but taking information and experiences from the primary world. There are many different categories of modern fantasy. Animal fantasy stories are with animals talking and behaving like humans. Personified toy stories are with toys talking and behaving like humans. Stories with outlandish characters and situations appear to be realistic fiction, but have characters who behave in outrageous, highly exaggerated ways that are impossible. There are also stories with magical powers, embellished fairy tales, expanded traditional tales, and stories in extraordinary worlds. These are not necessarily mutually exclusive categories. So a modern fantasy story can fall into multiple different categories. There are 6 basic motifs exhibited in fantasy literature. However, not all of them are necessarily used in a fantasy story. Magic is the most basic element in fantasy. The setting can be magical. A character might have magical abilities. An appearance of talking animals is also magical. Second motif is related to settings. In many fantasy stories, a special geography or universe is established. A simple method seen in many fairy tales is just setting the story up a long time ago. In second method, a totally different imaginary place can be the setting for the entire story. In third method, characters from our primary world can be taken into a secondary world through some sort of a portal seen in The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. The fourth method involves the secondary world invading our primary world. The third motif is the archetypical theme of good versus evil. Tensions between good versus evil become important part of plots of fantasy stories. The fourth motif is heroism. According to Babbitt, there are 6 distinctive structures that involve a hero. First, the hero is called to adventure by some sort of herald. Second, the hero crosses the threshold into the other world or into a place that is no longer safe and secure. Third, the hero must survive various trials in the new environment. Fourth, the hero is assisted by a protective figure. 5. The hero matures, becoming a whole person. 6. The hero returns to the initial setting after the mission is accomplished. The fifth motif is special character types. Fantasy stories often include characters from other worlds than our primary world. These characters are rarely typical humans. Fairies, pixies, giants, witches, vampires, and wizards are those special characters among many. The last motif is fantastic objects such as magic wands, swords, staffs, and mirrors. Science fiction is a sort of fantasy. However, science fiction uses science facts and concepts developed in the primary world. Brain transplantation can be an example. Some futuristic science fiction stories focus on dystopia. Dystopia is an imaginary place where people live dehumanized and often fearful lives caused by misuse or abuse of science. Science fantasy is somewhat different from science fiction. Science fantasy loosely plays with scientific concepts, and the plots are often mixed with magical occurrences as seen in the original Star Wars films. Science fantasy might use 6 basic fantasy motifs. Fantasy and science fiction are distinctive from one another based on the possibility that a similar event can take place in reality. The story in fantasy can never take place. On the other hand, there is a possibility that events in a science fiction story can take place, maybe not in our time or on our planet, some other time or some other planets. Authors engage readers in fantasy by anchoring stories in plausibility. They combine devices to make the fantasy believable to readers. They firmly ground the story in reality before gradually moving into fantasy. One of the characters mirrors the disbelief of the reader. The narrator or protagonist reassures readers that the fantastic events are real. The plot must have internal consistency and logic. The theme must be one that matters to people in our known world, whether we should desire eternal life or follow the life cycle as we know it is a question that people today care about. Ask these questions on the slide to yourself when you evaluate a modern fantasy story. Is the story well written according to literary standards? Is the theme compelling to readers in a real world as well as in a fantasy world? Are the elements that make the story a fantasy convincing, consistent, and well developed? Does the story allow readers to suspend disbelief? Does the author maintain a sense of logic and order within the created world? When you evaluate science fiction, consider these criteria. Is the story well written according to literary standards? Has the author made clear how the characters feel about their world and their dilemmas? Are there clear plot threads for the reader to follow in the invented world? Are there familiar guideposts that serve as jumping off places from reality to imagination for the reader? Does the author allow the reader to feel a sense of delight that encourages him or her to continue reading about an imaginary place? In addition, the Hugo Award is given annually for outstanding achievement in the writing of science fiction. You can check out some of the awardee books to select high-quality science fiction books for your classroom.